and who's running for office and why. That embedded in me. And, my young brain was like, this is what makes you an adult functioning member of society. Well, now we have this weird isolation period where kids are being kept away from their parents and put in indoctrination centers where they're told very strange and specific things, and they begin to adopt these behaviors. Which brings me to Josh Dawes' Twitter thread. He says, I'm seeing a lot of people on the right share this meme. While it may be a strong satirical response to those who get lost in nuance, it fundamentally fails to recognize why the left wants to talk to your kids about sexuality. Let's connect some dots. And someone tweeted, it's not rocket science, guys. They're just evil and want to diddle kids. It is overly simplistic. Josh says, the left doesn't want to diddle kids. They want to create little revolutionaries. To do that, they need to sever the bond between students and the parents they believe are raising their children to be hateful bigots. I don't think it's conscious, to be completely honest. I think you just have teachers of an ideology, a cult like religion, and they do these things second nature. He says, in order to sever the bond between parents and their children, the left is using a two-pronged approach. Critical race theory and radical gender ideology, properly known as queer theory, are not two unrelated sets of ideas. They are two parts of the same strategy. Critical race theory is usually the first set of ideas to be introduced. This is often enough to radicalize racial minorities, but is merely step one for white or white-adjacent students. CRT instills in these students a negative self-identity as they're taught to believe they're recipients of enormous privilege that was stolen from others, and they are complicit in historic and ongoing injustice. In child terms, they're taught to believe they're bad. Apart from the shame and guilt, this also gives them a worldview at odds with one their parents grew up with and are trying to pass on to their kids. Once CRT is done tearing down the kids and leaving them with negative self-identity, queer theory is introduced and offer them a wide assortment of positive self-identities to choose from. Instead of living with the shame and guilt of being a member of the oppressive dominant culture, students can be celebrated for coming out as gender non-binary or pan. In an instant, these kids can trade their negative self-identity and all the accompanying guilt and shame of being an oppressor for a positive self-identity and as a much venerated oppressed minority. There are similarities here to some religions. You're told that you harbor some guilt or shame and that you can be absolved of this by, making penance or doing something like that. Many religions have something akin to this. What I think is, many of these radical types recognized the function of religion and how people became to be religious, and said we need to quantify these things, atomize it, and then execute it. So the idea is they look at how people who are religious are told you have inherent guilt or original sin. And then you can be given an opportunity and they say, we can do that. We can do that. And so you have white privilege as original sin. You have your ability to make penance, to recognize your internalized misogyny or whatever, and become a better person. Here's where we end up. Like I was mentioning with the weird bouncy behaviors of kids, they'll absorb whatever it is you tell them for the most part and begin acting this way if they see it emulated back at them. If they see a teacher who behaves a certain way, it's not just about learning math. Teachers teach kids social behaviors. Kids are looking at teachers and seeing how they behave. Now, typically kids are looking at each other and learning from each other, which is a huge problem, mind you. Yeah, we replaced kids learning from adults with kids learning from kids, and it's been disastrous in my opinion. But when it comes to these teachers, they see the social behaviors and they begin to emulate. Now, Josh gets into the interesting part. Once the parents find out about what's happening to their kids, it's too late. There is now an adversarial relationship between the child and the parents. He says it takes extraordinarily deft parenting to repair the relationship. And I have conservatives come in my house to come on Timcast IRL say, my kids are about to go to college. And I'm like, are you nuts? Have you been paying attention to what you've been saying? That to me is crazy. But yeah, I read a story about somebody who said that their kid their daughter had become depressed. One day dyed her hair, shaved side of her head, started complaining about being in the wrong body. And so what they did was they immediately quit their job. How about that? And they weren't a wealthy individual. Went to the school and said, thank you so much for all the help you've been giving our child. We're changing jobs, so we're going to be moving to a new town. And they went, oh, okay. There's nothing the school can do about that. We're just moving for a new job. It's a normal thing that happens. They moved to the countryside, to a suburban area, to a suburban rural area. And they took their kids out of the school, started homeschooling them. And then within a few weeks, they were no longer depressed. They let their hair grow back out, started doing normal kid stuff. And they were like, that's how you got to do it. Because if you go to the school and say, what you're doing to my kid is wrong, the school says you're abusing your child, and now we're bringing the state in. And that's where Joe Biden steps in. Joe Biden says, to parents of transgender children, affirming your child's identity is one of the most powerful things you can do to keep them safe and healthy. Look, I think some kids do have dysphoria. I think some kids do have body dysmorphia. I think some kids actually can be gay. There are certain kids that have, certain behaviors or certain developmental issues or certain developmental traits. And, people can make predictions or assumptions, but it is a very, very small minority of children. So if your child comes to you and says they think, they really wish they were a dragon or something, perhaps they're consuming too much dragon content stuff. I don't know. Maybe they need to spend most of their time absorbing the real world and going out and foraging or camping, spend more time around people and develop an identity around other humans. Too much fictional content, too many video games, it can have strange effects on people, and I think it is. For Joe Biden to say this is interesting because Sweden doesn't do this. Sweden actually gives psychiatric and psychosocial services, as brought up by Colin Wright. The point being, there's disparate views on what should or shouldn't be. I'm curious as to why it is that there's not, for kids who are furries, we don't have furry affirming care. I don't care if you're trans or a furry. You're allowed to do what you want to do. I'm just saying, where is Joe Biden to come out and say if your kid wants to be Volsiferon, Herald of the Winter Mists, you should affirm that? What if your kid comes out and says they want to be a Demogorgon monster, and so they want, body modification? What if a young girl says she wants to identify as Pamela Anderson in the mid-90s and she wants implants? You'd say no to that. But why? It's a sexual identity issue. What's the difference? Serious question. What's the difference? If a 12-year-old boy says he wants implants, are they going to say yes or no? Your parents are probably going to say no to it. But what's the difference? Body modification for someone to self-express. In the end, when Joe Biden and the Justice Department come out and say this, I need only say one thing. If the left wants whatever they want, fine, whatever. This country is being split in two, and there's going to come a point where the right says absolutely not. And we're getting dangerously close to that. The left and the right are already at odds with each other. The left is advocating for teachers to have conversations about sexual issues with children in secret. I mean, to me, that's crazy. But they're adamant about pursuing this. Will parents in this country say no? I think the overwhelming majority of parents reject that, but will they stand up? I suppose we'll see. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up at 1 p.m. on this channel. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.